Hello and welcome to The Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the heartbreaking yet fascinating case of two teenage boys whose death back in 1987 was initially deemed to be an accident. However, with so much information surrounding their deaths that just doesn't seem to add up, many believe the truth is far more sinister, involving both a police and possibly political cover-up. With over 35 years since the death of these young men, it seems unlikely that what happened to them will ever be conclusively proved. I will detail what is known as fairly and unbiasedly as possible, and would be fascinated to hear your thoughts, theories and opinions in the comments section below. Before I begin, I would like to say a big thank you to Luke at Unsolvable for bringing this story to my attention and letting me have his research on the subject. So now, on to today's story. The year was 1987 and two young men were about to become seniors at Bryant High School in Arkansas. 17-year-old Kevin Ives, the second child and only son of Larry and Linda Ives, was a popular young man. He was a good student who was liked by both his teachers and classmates. He enjoyed working on his car and playing video games. Kevin had been close friends with 16-year-old Don Henry for around 6 months. Don, the son of Curtis and Marvell Henry, was also a well-liked young man who had a welcoming personality and would happily strike up a conversation with anyone. In the early evening of Saturday, August the 22nd, 1987, the two young men met up with a group of friends at the commuter parking lot, which was a popular hangout spot for local teenagers. The boys would occasionally have an alcoholic drink and the odd marijuana cigarette, and on this occasion it is believed they, and many others in the group, had shared a marijuana cigarette or two. They returned to Don's house where Kevin was staying that night, but as they were not ready to go to sleep, they made plans to go hunting in a woodland area near Don's home. Night hunting was an activity which they had taken part in before with the consent of their parents and wasn't seen as anything unusual to them at that time. The two young men left at around 12:15 a.m. and headed towards the woodland, which ran alongside the railway tracks close to Don's house. They had packed supplies, torches and a .22 caliber rifle. It is unclear what they did next or exactly where they went. The next time that they were seen was around 4 a.m. A 75-car, 6,000-ton cargo train was making its regular night run to Little Rock, Arkansas. The train was just over a mile long and was travelling at around 50 miles per hour. As the train approached the small town of Bryant, engineer Stephen Schroyer spotted the two boys lying in identical positions across the train tracks. A green tarpaulin was wrapped around them and a rifle lay beside them. Stephen blew the horn several times, but the boys remained motionless. He applied the emergency brakes, but due to the weight and momentum of the train, he was unable to stop it in time. The train ran over the two boys and continued for approximately half a mile before coming to a complete stop. Stephen and the crew that were aboard the train immediately reported the incident to the authorities. The police arrived on the scene at about 4:40 a.m. The boys' bodies, together with the rifle, were retrieved, but the green tarpaulin was never found. Following the investigation and an autopsy conducted by State Medical Examiner Dr. Alksan, the deaths were recorded as an accident. The medical examiner said that from the toxins found in the boys' bodies, they were under the influence of marijuana at the time of their deaths. From the levels found, he concluded that they had smoked the equivalent of 20 marijuana cigarettes, and it was his belief that the boys had slipped into a drug-induced coma and had fallen asleep on the tracks. However, Curtis and Marvell Henry, together with Linda and Larry Ives, were far from convinced that this was how their sons had died. There were too many factors that just did not add up. Neither set of parents believed that their sons were heavily involved in drugs, nor did they believe that the boys would be foolish enough to trespass onto the railway tracks. It was questioned whether marijuana, even in the quantities suggested, would cause a loss of consciousness to the point that neither of the boys so much as flinched as the train came hurtling towards them with the loud horns blaring. If the boys had passed out due to a drug-induced coma, it seems incredibly unlikely that they would be neatly lying in identical positions on the railway tracks. Don's father thought that it was very strange that Don's rifle had been laid on the gravel. Don always took great care of his rifle, and his father did not believe that his son would carelessly leave it on the ground where it could easily have been scratched or damaged. As more questions as to the thoroughness of the police investigation arose, Kevin's family made the decision to hire a private investigator to look into the case. However, every time this investigator attempted to speak with the police or other investigation agencies, he was met with resistance. Those involved with the case seemed unwilling to cooperate or answer any questions about what had happened. Desperate to get some help finding out what had happened to their sons, 5 months after Don and Kevin's deaths, their parents held a press conference in the hope that getting the case back in the public eye would lead to it being re-investigated. Their plan worked, and the next day the case was officially reopened. In February 1988, it was reported that the official report on file at the Saline Memorial Hospital from a paramedic called Shirley that blood from the bodies and on the body parts we observed was a dark colour in nature. Due to our training, this would indicate a lack of oxygen present in the blood and could pose a question as to how long the victims had been dead. At the hearing, Shirley also testified that she had seen a pickup truck with 3 people inside in the early hours of the morning of August 23rd in the general area of the railroad tracks. When asked by prosecutor Richard Garrett why she had not mentioned the truck to investigators, she said that she had never been interviewed by them, adding that no one asked me anything until last week. Stephen Schroyer, the train engineer, said that there was no muscle reaction whatsoever from either boy before impact, adding, "After the decision came along that indicated intoxication, it increased my concern." By March 1988, the prosecutor, Richard Garrett, requested that the boys' bodies be exhumed for another autopsy, since he was sceptical of the initial findings about marijuana toxicity levels in their blood. The second autopsy was conducted by Dr. Joseph Burton, and he found that the toxicity in the blood was the equivalent of just 1 or 2 marijuana cigarettes, and not the initial 20 that were originally cited. Dr. Burton also discovered evidence that suggested Don had sustained a stab wound to his back and was already dead by the time he was hit by the train. Kevin had a fractured skull and was likely to have been unconscious at the time of the collision. This new information led a grand jury to rule the deaths as probable homicides, and by May 1988 it was reported that the FBI would be investigating the deaths alongside state police. The investigation continued with Richard Garrett focusing on the green tarpaulin, which several witnesses, including Stephen Schroyer, claimed to have seen Don and Kevin wrapped in on the railway line. The police denied ever finding the tarpaulin and claimed that Stephen had never told them about it in his statements. Stephen remained adamant that he had. It was reported in the press that the authorities say they never saw the tarpaulin and contend the train crew experienced an optical illusion. Richard Garrett also uncovered another incident that was oddly similar to this one. It had occurred in Oklahoma 3 years earlier on the 25th of June 1984 and involved 2 young men, 21-year-old Billy Hainline and 26-year-old Dennis Decker. They were also found lying on railway tracks and positioned almost identically to Kevin and Don. Initially, Dennis and Billy's deaths were ruled an accident by the local coroner, but following an autopsy, this was changed to undetermined by the state medical examiner. However, there were no arrests in this case. Richard, together with Don and Kevin's families, were convinced that the boys had been murdered, and on the 10th of September 1988, it was reported that the grand jury agreed. The boys' cause of death was changed from probable homicide to definite homicide. Despite this change, further investigation and a substantial reward, no arrests were made, and the murder of these two teenage boys remains unsolved to this day. There are, however, many theories, conspiracies, and unusual deaths surrounding this case. One suspect who the police were keen to pursue was an unknown and unidentified man who wore a military uniform. A few weeks prior to the death of Don and Kevin, a police officer by the name of Danny Allen had spotted a man in a military uniform acting suspiciously in the area around the railway tracks. Danny stopped to question the man, but the man opened fire and made his escape. The surrounding area was searched, but the man was never found. On the night Don and Kevin died, witnesses claimed to have seen an unknown man in a military uniform heading down a road less than 200 metres from where Don and Kevin were later hit by the train. Despite there being several witnesses, the police were never able to locate or identify this man. Furthermore, on the 10th of November 1988, it was reported that 44-year-old Keith McCaskill, a manager of a nightclub near the Saline-Pulaski county line, had been killed after being stabbed over 100 times. According to Richard Garrett, Keith had the role of keeping his ears open in the investigation into Kevin and Don's deaths. Keith was not a potential witness for the grand jury and had been visited in relation to the investigation, with the information he gave being described as not earth-shattering. It was later reported that there was no official link between his death and that of Don and Kevin. One theory, perhaps the one which many see as the most credible, is that the boys had accidentally wandered into an area where a drug drop was taking place and were killed because they saw something which they weren't supposed to. Richard Garrett was quoted as saying that Saline County and the central Arkansas area is overrun at this time with drug trafficking, and it's drug trafficking at a high level that extends to other states and other counties. He went on to say that, "I think that the boys saw something they shouldn't have seen, and it had to do with drugs, either with a crank lab which manufactures methamphetamine, or certain individuals involved in those matters, and those people felt like the information they had was such that they could not allow them to live." He added that, "I think there is a distinct possibility that there are other parties involved. The thing is, the case is so complex that the solution could tie to something as simple as a vagrant or a migrant on the railroad track doing it and going away and us never hearing anything from him again, or be as complicated as a police involvement. There certainly was a cover-up at first, whether inadvertent or through lack of attention or through just plain stubbornness." It is known that the town of Bryant was linked to a large drug trafficking operation ran out of Mena, Arkansas, by a man known as Adler Berryman Seal, who was also known as Barry Seal. Barry was a commercial airline pilot who regularly flew to and from the Mena airport in Polk County in the 1980s, smuggling drugs from Colombia back into the US. When he was convicted of smuggling charges, he became an informant for the DEA and testified in several major drug trials. Barry died in 1986, the year before the boys, but it is safe to assume that the drug operation continued without him. Special Prosecutor Dan Harmon said that while he was disappointed that no charges were brought for the boys' murder, he predicted that whoever killed them would be brought to justice if Saline County authorities increased their war on drugs. In the weeks that followed the incident, a local witness came forward stating that he had seen two boys attempting to make a phone call on a payphone before being descended upon by two police officers who beat them senseless in a store parking lot before tossing them into the back of an unmarked police car and then driving away, although likely it has never been proven that these two boys were Don and Kevin. In the years that followed the boys' deaths, several authority figures involved in the case were also linked to drugs. For example, Dan Harmon, the initial prosecuting attorney representing Don and Kevin's parents, was jailed in 1997 for several counts of racketeering, extortion, and drug possession with intent to distribute, and ended up serving 11 years in prison. Many have questioned if Dr. Fahmi Malak, the state medical examiner who gave the original autopsy, was part of the operation and the cover-up. During the initial inquiry, he made many questionable rulings, and as such was later investigated several times. In the years that followed, outside pathologists were brought in to review and reassess dozens of autopsies that he had conducted. In 1996, it was reported that many people in Arkansas who claimed to have information about the boys' deaths wound up dead themselves. A guy called Keith Coney died when his motorcycle slammed into the back of a truck in July 1988. Gregory Collins died from a gunshot wound in January 1989. Jeff Rhodes was shot, mutilated and burned in April 1989. James Millan was found decapitated, and his death was ruled as being due to natural causes. Jordan Cates was shot to death in the front seat of his pickup in June 1990, and Richard Winters, who was a suspect in the boys' deaths, was killed in a robbery in July 1989. Rumours and speculation about the case continued to circulate for many years, even stretching as far as the then Governor of Arkansas and future President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Many newspaper reports stated what they saw as an unusual high amount of deaths amongst those close to Bill Clinton between 1979 and 1992, when he was the Governor of Arkansas, with quotes such as, "There were many more deaths, assaults and beatings among people loosely associated with the Clintons, or drug smuggling at the Arkansas airport, which Bill Clinton was governor." Additionally, the Clinton Chronicles that was released in 1994 was a controversial documentary that accuses Bill Clinton in a range of crimes. With politics involved, many people will fall on either side of the political divide when deciding if this film is based on a series of conspiracy theories or is grounded in fact. The murder of Don Henry and Kevin Ives was mentioned in this video. There have obviously been many miles of newspaper inches dedicated to the Clintons over the years, many of which would have been affected by political leanings, with people throughout the political spectrum holding a variety of different views as to Bill Clinton's responsibility for many such events. In 1999, a jury awarded two former sheriff's deputies $600,000 after they claimed that they had been defamed by the 1996 film about the boys called Obstruction of Justice: The Men's Connection. This case was later thrown out on appeal in 2001. More recently, in 2018, former professional wrestler Billy Jack Haynes featured in some videos alleging that he had evidence of the boys being run over by the train. He claims corrupt police officers who were involved in the drug trade killed the two boys because they had witnessed a drug drop. Again, how credible this information is has not been fully determined. It remains a mystery exactly what happened to Don Henry and Kevin Ives that night in August 1987. As time passes, it becomes increasingly unlikely that additional information will come to light, leaving their loved ones without answers. We are only able to guess, question and speculate as to what we believe happened, and I would love to hear your thoughts and theories on the case in the comments section below. That concludes today's story. I just wanted to mention a friend of mine. You may already know Alex from Murderous Minds, and he started a new channel called Horror Behind the Photo. He uses images of true crime and dark history and presents each video in a much shorter format. Oh, and as a bonus, he even has a voice similar to what Dracula would sound like. I will leave a link in the description. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. In 2012, a memorial bench was placed at Alexander City Park to remember Don and Kevin. Goodbye.